I have watched people work too hard for too long to stay broke in ways that were completely avoidable. That is one of the strangest things about money in America. The people who can least afford waste are often surrounded by products, contracts, habits, and little financial traps designed to make waste feel normal, not luxurious, not reckless. Normal, that is how the damage gets done. Most people assume poverty is only about income. I do not believe that. Income matters, of course it matters, but I have seen enough balance sheets, enough business decisions, and enough household mistakes to know that what matters just as much is where your scarce capital goes once it arrives. If every dollar that comes into your life is immediately sent into assets that fall in value, convenience that vanishes overnight, or financing terms that were built to exploit desperation, then it does not matter how hard you work. You are carrying water uphill. That is why I have always thought the real difference between poor thinking and wealthy thinking is not style. It is allocation. Poor thinking says I need relief right now. Wealthy thinking says I need strength later. Poor thinking looks at the monthly payment. Wealthy thinking looks at the total cost. Poor thinking asks whether something fits in this week's cash flow. Wealthy thinking asks what that same money could become if it were left alone and allowed to compound. I do not say that to insult anybody. I say it because until you learn to see money through the lens of opportunity cost, you will keep mistaking expensive habits for harmless habits. And once that happens, your future starts getting sold off in little pieces that barely feel like sales. That is the real tragedy. Most wealth is not destroyed in one dramatic explosion. It is drained through repeated decisions that look small when viewed one at a time and catastrophic when viewed together. A new car that begins by making you feel successful. A stack of lottery tickets that makes you feel hopeful. A payday loan that promises temporary relief and creates permanent weakness. Furniture financed through rent to own contracts that turn ordinary objects into multi-year liabilities. Protection plans and little insurance products that make you pay again and again to avoid risks that were never worth insuring in the first place. Streaming bundles, premium packages, subscriptions, and monthly entertainment clutter that quietly teach your bank account to bleed. Fast food, gas station stops, convenience purchases, coffee runs, little daily indulgences that do not look like wealth killers until they have eaten years of your life. Individually, none of those things announces itself as a financial catastrophe. Together, they can become a machine for keeping a person in the same place year after year. I want to explain why, because once you understand the underlying pattern, you stop seeing these purchases as isolated consumer choices. You start seeing them for what they often are. They are capital leaks. And if you do not stop capital leaks, you do not build wealth. It is that simple. The first category of mistake is the one people defend most emotionally because it is tied to identity. They buy status before they buy strength. Nothing illustrates that more clearly than the brand new car. I have seen this over and over. A person gets the first decent job of his life. Maybe the income rises from surviving to stable. Maybe not even stable, just better than before. And almost immediately he wants proof that life is improving. He does not buy the strongest balance sheet. He buys the loudest symbol, a new car with a long loan, a high payment, high insurance, and predictable depreciation. This is one of the cruelest deals in finance because it punishes people at exactly the stage when they are most fragile. You are not rich yet. You do not have layers of margin. You do not have a large asset base quietly compounding behind the scenes. You may have improved income, but improved income is not the same thing as durable wealth. And yet, at that exact moment, many people volunteer to make one of the worst capital allocation decisions available to them. They borrow money to buy an asset that starts shrinking the moment they take possession of it. They commit future paychecks to pay interest on a declining object. They turn the early years of financial ascent into years of guaranteed drag. I have never liked that arrangement. When you are trying to build wealth, the point is to gradually convert labor into productive assets. A brand new car often does the reverse. It converts your future labor into a monthly obligation tied to something that is practically designed to move downward in value. That is not asset building. That is asset surrender dressed up as progress. And the worst part is that people rarely evaluate it honestly. They tell themselves the payment is manageable. That sentence has ruined a great many households. Manageable compared to what? Manageable compared to having no emergency fund. Manageable compared to not investing. Manageable compared to staying trapped in a job you cannot leave because the car note, the insurance, the fuel, and the rest of the machine now require you to stay in motion. The payment may be manageable in the narrowest sense. The opportunity cost may be enormous. This is why I have always preferred durable used cars bought after someone else has paid the most painful depreciation. What matters is not whether your neighbors think you are moving up. What matters is whether your balance sheet is moving up. A person who drives a used vehicle and quietly invests the difference is often buying freedom, even if he does not feel glamorous doing it. A person who buys the symbol first is often buying applause and surrendering freedom. That is the first distinction. The second category of mistake is even more damaging because it corrupts the way a person thinks about rescue. He outsources hope to bad odds. That is where lottery tickets live. I understand why the lottery tempts people. If a person feels cornered, exhausted, and structurally behind, then a tiny purchase that offers a fantasy of escape can feel almost rational. In emotional terms, it is very easy to understand. In financial terms, it is disastrous. What makes the lottery so corrosive is not only the bad math, it is the mental model behind it. It trains people to look for salvation in an event rather than in a process. That is deadly. Wealth, in my experience, is almost never built by one miraculous turning point. It is built by repeated sound decisions made when no miracle is present. It is built by automatic contributions, steady investing, delayed gratification, and the willingness to accept progress that feels boring for a long time. The lottery tells the opposite story. It tells the struggling person that the way out is not structure, but luck, not discipline, but chance, not compounding, but fantasy. And if you repeatedly spend on fantasy, you do more than lose the dollars. You weaken the habit of building reality. That may be the most expensive part of all. A $5 ticket is not just $5. It is $5 plus the story you are teaching yourself about how life gets fixed. If the story becomes maybe the answer is a miracle, then you are drifting farther from the habits that actually rescue people. I have said many times that the stock market is a mechanism for transferring money from the impatient to the patient. In a broader sense, personal finance works the same way. The disciplined person is willing to let ordinary actions compound. The desperate person wants transformation right now. Products aimed at desperate people make fortunes because they understand that urgency is easier to sell than patience. The lottery sells urgency in the form of hope. I would rather own patience. The third category of mistake appears when a household has no cushion and the world delivers even a small blow-now desperation meets financing. This is where payday loans enter, and I do not mind telling you that I find the whole business repulsive. A short-term cash need becomes a 2-week loan with triple-digit annualized cost, and then the borrower rolls it over because the original problem never went away. That is not relief. That is a trap disguised as speed. People often misunderstand what makes payday lending so destructive. They focus on the interest rate alone, and of course the interest rate is grotesque. But the deeper damage is structural. Payday lending enters when a household has no shock absorber, no emergency fund, no room in the budget, no slack. That means a relatively small disruption, a repair, a late bill, a timing mismatch, can force the person into the hands of somebody offering immediate cash at catastrophic terms. This is why I care so much about margin. Margin is not an abstract concept. Margin is what keeps a broken alternator from becoming 6 months of chaos. Margin is what keeps a rent deadline from turning into an extraction event. Margin is what separates inconvenience from collapse. When you have no margin, every problem becomes expensive. When you have some margin, many problems remain annoying but survivable. A wealthy mind thinks constantly about building margin before the emergency. A poor mind is often forced to think only about escape during the emergency. That is not a character flaw. Sometimes it is a consequence of life being hard for too long, but it is still a pattern that has to be broken or it will keep reproducing itself. The way out is not glamorous. It is to create a small reserve with stubborn consistency. $25, $50, whatever can be carved out without fiction. People who do not have reserves end up buying liquidity at absurd prices. People with even modest reserves buy themselves negotiating power. That is the first taste of financial dignity. The next trap is subtler because it does not look like borrowing in the usual sense. It looks like affordability. Rent-to-own furniture, televisions, electronics, household goods, all of it thrives on one psychological weakness. People do not ask what this costs. They ask what this costs per month. That is how they get captured. A sofa is not $5,000 in their mind. It is only $69 a month. A television is not wildly overpriced. It is only $39 a month. The word only has emptied many bank accounts. Once you stop looking at totals, you become easy to exploit. That is why one of the most useful money habits in the world is to convert every monthly pitch back into total cost. Not just for furniture, for everything. What is the total cost? What is the interest? How long is the commitment? What else could this money do? What happens if life changes before the contract ends? A wealthy person is not always the one with the bigger income. Often, he is the one who asks total cost questions before signing long-term obligations. Rent-to-own contracts punish people twice. First, they overcharge them. Second, they normalize the idea that basic household life must be financed through expensive fragmentation. Instead of learning to delay, buy secondhand, use the ugly chair for a while longer, search marketplace, visit estate sales, make do, and preserve capital, the household learns to translate immediate desire into long-term drain. I do not think that lesson produces freedom. I think it produces chronic weakness. One thing I learned early is that ownership is not about whether something is sitting in your living room. Ownership is about whether it is truly yours without years of extraction still attached to it. A person with used furniture bought cheaply may have less style and more strength. A person with financed status items may have more style and less control. If I have to choose, I will take control. Now let me move to a category of spending that people treat as prudent, even when it often is not. They insure what will not ruin them and neglect what will. Extended warranties, small device insurance, little protection plans. These things often exploit people's fear of inconvenience. In many cases, the original product already comes with warranty coverage. Cards may extend that coverage, and even when something goes wrong, the consumer has paid so much in premiums or plan costs that self-funding would often have left him in a better position. The rule here is very simple. You insure against catastrophe. You do not usually insure against irritation. A house fire is a catastrophe. A major medical event is a catastrophe. The loss of income in a family that depends on you can be a catastrophe. A cracked phone screen is aggravating. It is not a catastrophe. A broken set of headphones is not a catastrophe. A laptop failing after several years of use is not pleasant, but it is not a reason to create a permanent stream of little insurance premiums if a modest replacement reserve could cover the problem more efficiently. The poor household often pays to feel protected. The stronger household builds reserves so it can actually handle the loss. That distinction matters. When you continually buy small warranties and add-ons, you are doing something more than spending money. You are weakening your habit of self-insuring through savings. You are teaching yourself that every inconvenience deserves a paid buffer. But if you built the buffer yourself, you would keep the money when nothing bad happened. That is how strength accumulates, not by paying strangers over and over to hold your fear for you. The next trap lives inside the modern monthly economy. It is entertainment clutter, premium cable, too many streaming services, bundled media costs, subscription layers that feel harmless individually and heavy collectively. I do not object to entertainment. I object to unconscious recurring spending. That is an important difference. A person who chooses one service and uses it intentionally is making a decision. A person who keeps 5 because canceling feels annoying is not making a decision. He is drifting. Money hates drift. Drift is where the waste goes unnoticed. This is why recurring charges deserve much more suspicion than people give them. The one-time purchase hurts because you feel it. The recurring purchase numbs you because you stop feeling it. But the recurring purchase may be far more dangerous precisely because it becomes part of the background. It turns into one more permanent claimant on your income. Wealth is built by reducing permanent claimants. Every month should not begin with a dozen hands already reaching into your pocket. The same problem exists with food convenience, and in some households it is worse. Fast food, gas station drinks, coffee runs, grab-and-go lunches, quick stops that become daily habits. These are among the most underestimated wealth destroyers because each purchase is so small that it hardly deserves moral attention. This is where opportunity cost becomes a life-changing concept. A $10 lunch is not only $10. A $5 coffee is not only $5. A soda and chips from a convenience store are not only a few dollars. What they are depends on frequency. Anything repeated becomes structural. That is what people miss. If a thing happens once, it is a choice. If it happens 5 times a week for 10 years, it is architecture, and architecture shapes outcomes. I am not against enjoyment. I am against automatic leakage. The household that cannot stop bleeding at the edges will never understand why the center remains weak. People want some giant explanation for why wealth does not seem to accumulate. Sometimes the explanation is not giant at all. It is 1,000 little leaks, none of which felt important enough to challenge when they first appeared. A wealthy mind notices leaks early. A poor mind often notices only the absence of progress later. That brings me to the deepest point in all of this. These 7 traps are not random. They are all variations of the same underlying habit. They all privilege the present feeling over the future position. The new car says, "Let me look successful now." The lottery says, "Let me feel possibility now." The payday loan says, "Let me escape pressure now." The rent-to-own deal says, "Let me have the object now." The warranty says, "Let me feel safe now." The streaming bundle says, "Let me stay entertained now." The convenience purchase says, "Let me save effort now." There is nothing mysterious about why this pattern keeps people stuck. If you repeatedly reward the current self at the expense of the future self, then the future self arrives underfunded every single time. That future self eventually becomes the tired middle-aged worker with no reserves, no investments, too many obligations, and no idea why life still feels fragile despite years of effort. I do not say that with contempt. I say it with urgency, because once you see the pattern, you can start reversing it. And the reversal does not require brilliance. It requires interruption. You do not need to fix everything in 1 week. In fact, trying to become morally perfect with money overnight is one of the fastest ways to fail. The more intelligent path is structural. Cut one leak, redirect the money, automate the redirect, let that become normal, then cut another leak. Redirect that money too. That is exactly right. Loose money disappears. Directed money compounds. If a household removes lottery spending and sends that amount to a Roth IRA every month, the story changes. If a household drives a used car and invests the avoided payment, the story changes. If a household eliminates one predatory financing cycle and builds even a modest emergency reserve, the story changes. If a household stops furnishing its insecurity with long-term payment plans and starts buying used, delaying upgrades, and keeping ownership simple, the story changes. If the subscriptions are cut, the takeout frequency is halved, the convenience purchases are challenged, and the difference is actually captured instead of casually spent somewhere else, the story changes again. What matters is not the moral drama of the moment. What matters is the direction of capital. Your capital flowing toward compounding or toward consumption that disappears, toward ownership or toward friction, toward flexibility or toward dependence, toward future freedom or toward present sedation. Once you learn to ask those questions, you stop experiencing money as a blur. You begin to experience it as a sequence of capital allocation decisions, and that is where power begins. I have spent a lifetime studying capital allocation at the corporate level, but the principle is no different in a household. Good outcomes tend to go to those who allocate scarce resources toward productive ends and away from ego, leakage, and recurring drag. A family may never use that language, but it lives under the same arithmetic. One reason some people never get ahead is that they keep financing a lifestyle that cannot produce anything back. The objects decay, the convenience vanishes, the entertainment ends, the scratch. Off-ticket goes in the trash. The overpriced soda is consumed in 20 minutes. The financed furniture becomes old furniture while the payment somehow remains fresh. Meanwhile, the dollars that could have become ownership, reserves, dividends, options, and breathing room are gone. That is the whole story. You do not become wealthy by making every decision perfectly. You become wealthy by refusing to repeatedly make the same obviously costly decisions once you understand them clearly. Wealth is not usually built by giant income alone. It is built by keeping more of what you earn and putting it to work. That is the game, not appearance, not temporary relief, not emotional spending disguised as necessity. Keeping and compounding. And the opposite is also true. Poverty is often prolonged by paying too much for symbols, speed, convenience, fantasy, and fear. Once you see that, the world looks different. A car payment can look like a $250,000 decision in disguise. A weekly stack of lottery tickets can look like a retirement account set on fire one hopeful scratch at a time. A convenience store habit can look like a tax on your future imposed by your current laziness. A streaming bundle can look like a recurring claim on capital that could have been learning how to work for you. A small device warranty can look like an admission that you still have not built enough strength to self-insure against irritation. This is not about deprivation. It is about deciding what kind of future you are funding. If you fund comfort at every moment, you may never fund freedom. If you fund freedom consistently, you can still have comfort later, and you can have it without chains attached. That is the better bargain. So if I were speaking to someone who feels trapped financially, I would not begin by asking how much he makes. I would begin by asking where his money goes when it arrives. Which leaks are recurring? Which purchases are really painkillers? Which obligations are tied to pride rather than utility? Which habits are stealing capital that should be buying resilience? Because once those questions are answered honestly, the path forward usually becomes simpler than people expect. Not easy, but simple. Drive humbler, borrow less, insure catastrophes, not inconveniences, stop paying for fantasies, stop financing ordinary objects at extraordinary cost, cut recurring entertainment clutter, reduce convenience leakage, build a reserve, invest the difference. Repeat that process long enough and the old identity starts to die. The person who once spent to feel relief becomes the person who saves to create strength. The person who once looked only at payments begins looking at total cost. The person who once wanted proof today begins building freedom for tomorrow. That shift is everything, because the 7 things that keep poor people poor are not really 7 things. They are 7 expressions of the same idea. And the idea is this: a dollar can either serve your future. You do not need a higher IQ to understand that. You need the courage to stop letting your present cravings auction off your future life. That is how wealth begins. Not with a miracle, not with a secret, not with luck, but with the decision that from this point on, your money will stop leaking into obvious traps and start marching in one direction, toward ownership, toward margin, toward compounding, toward freedom.